Perfect. So, good morning, everyone. Welcome to FlaskCon Edition 2. So, I have here with me today David, and David is starting to talk to us right now about taming OAuth with Flask-Dance. And just remind everyone, if you have any questions, we're streaming through YouTube and Twitch, Python Island's Twitch. If you have any questions or if you'd like to let us know anything, please just post a comment on the Discord channel. You can find the Discord channel and our website. And well, good morning, David. Welcome.
Hi, good to see you all. So the quick introduction slide, I'm DB. My name is David, but I typically go by my initials. I'm a freelancer. I'm a full stack web developer with 10 plus years of experience. Born in America, living in Amsterdam these days. I've done a couple of tech talks like this. I enjoy learning and sharing knowledge and such. And I'm a contractor, so if you're interested in what I have to say and you want to work with me, contact me and maybe we can work together. But I'm not here to talk about myself. I'm here to talk about OAuth and Flask-Dance. So for starters, we need to understand the problem space so that we can understand what this whole Flask-Dance tool is, and that is OAuth. What is OAuth? Let's do a quick history lesson to understand what the problem is and where it came from. You see, back in the bad old days, before OAuth came along, if there was a user that wanted to connect their profile on website A to another profile on website B, the only way to do that was to share authentication credentials directly. So let's say there was a website that wanted to post updates on your MySpace page or something like that. The website would just ask for your MySpace username and password. And you, as the user, would have to trust that the website was using that information only to do the things it said it was going to do. But of course, with your authentication credentials, the website could log in as you and in fact change your password and lock you out of your own account. Clearly, this is not really a very good state of affairs. So OAuth came along, and OAuth is a protocol that allows users to authorize or connect accounts from one website to another without sharing passwords. Now, that is a way of basically saying that you can have two websites connect with each other, and you can be certain that the websites are only sharing information that you, as the user, want them to share. And you can also be certain that your account is still secure despite the information being shared. So how does OAuth actually work? This is where dance part of Flask-Dance comes in. And you'll see it's a complicated multi-step process, sort of like doing a dance between multiple different parties. So there are three different roles involved in this OAuth dance. There's the user, who is the person who has an account on both websites. And then there's the API consumer, and then there's the API producer. In this example, I'm going to use Google as the API producer because most people are familiar with Google and most people have at least one Google account. And you can think of the API consumer as some little website that you've come across on the internet that wants to allow you to log in using your Google account. So there's the setup process of the OAuth dance. Now this happens before the user comes along. Typically this happens weeks or months in advance of any sort of actual live interaction happening. The consumer website wants to ask the provider to use an API that is enabled with OAuth. And the provider gives them an API key and secret. Now this is important because the provider and the consumer don't have to know each other or trust each other. So if the consumer does something nasty with the API, then the provider can simply cut off access by disabling that API key and secret. So then the user comes along. And the user says, oh, I'd like to log in with Google, please. So now at this point, the consumer needs to find out what user account the user has on Google. So the website is going to redirect the user to Google so that the user can provide permission to share that information with the consumer website. So then the user is redirected to the API provider, in this case, Google. And the API provider says, okay, this website wants to know your email address. And if the user agrees with that, then they send the user back to the original API consumer along with a special secret code, which is just a sort of made up string of letters and numbers. Then the user arrives back at that consumer website, hands over the code, and says, all right, I don't know anything about this code, but Google told me to give it to you, so I'm doing it. Then the consumer website takes that secret code and passes it to the API provider. And this works as a proof that the user has provided consent for that information to be shared. Now, these codes are designed to be one-time use. So instead of continuing to use that same code, the API provider will provide an access token instead. And the access token has the same sort of permissions as a user password with a couple of crucial differences. One is that it's unique for every API provider and user combination. And it's also temporary in that you can cancel a token and it won't affect any other tokens that have been issued. I guess temporary is the wrong word. I should say it's specific to that use case. So then the API consumer has this token, which functions as proof that the user has granted permission for the consumer to have the data that was requested. So from that point on, once the consumer has this token, the consumer is allowed to make requests to the provider asking for the information that was granted. And every time a request is made, the provider has to check a whole checklist of different things to make sure that that request is valid and should go through. Is it a valid API token? Does it match an active user that I know about? Has the consumer's API access not been revoked? Has the user not revoked permission? Because users can always say, actually, I don't really want this consumer website to have my information anymore. I want to stop that. So the provider has to check that as well. And whatever information the consumer is asking for, the provider has to verify that the information being given matches what the user has consented to. So then the provider will provide that information on the API. So the end result is the user's web browser is redirected to all of these different URLs very quickly, and the user has to click on a button that says, yes, I accept, you can give my information to this third-party site. And from the user's perspective, everything is very easy. But as a developer, as someone who's trying to implement this whole OAuth process, this whole OAuth dance, it's actually quite complicated to make sure that everything gets implemented correctly and without any security holes. So what is this Flask-Dance thing, now that I've finished talking about OAuth? In summary, you can think of as OAuth is complicated. This is a diagram that describes basically what I just described. Flask-Dance makes it way, way simpler. And this short piece of code, this like a 15 or 20 line of examples, that's a real working example. And not only is this a real example, I'm going to show you how we can take this very short piece of code and deploy it as a Flask application that actually works with OAuth. This is not a toy, this is real. So I am done with my presentation slides, and I am going to switch over to the live website, which has the documentation for Flask-Dance. You can see it's at flashdance.readthedocs.io. And this is some documentation that I've written for the project in collaboration with a couple of other people. Documentation is always changing and evolving, and if you want to use this project and you're confused, please let me know and we can hopefully improve this. But we have this same example that I was talking about earlier, and I'm going to jump to the quick start section where you can get a couple of different example repositories that work with a couple of different services. Now, this is not the only thing that Flask-Dance can do. Flask-Dance actually works with a whole bunch of different providers. And even if it doesn't work with the provider that you want, you can support a custom provider and make it work with whatever OAuth provider you want. But this is the whole list of providers that Flask-Dance works with sort of built in. So it's fairly extensive already. But in this case, we're going to go with the easiest option, doing Flask sessions with OAuth to GitHub. So what I have here is a repository, which is sort of just an example application. And there's a whole bunch of files in this repository, but the only one that you really need to care about is this github.py. And this is, as I've said, it's 19 lines, it's very short, and it uses Flask-Dance to set up this OAuth connection. I've also set this up with Heroku, so there's this handy little deploy to Heroku button, and I'm gonna really hope that my live demo works properly. It should jump me over to Heroku, yes. So I can deploy my own FlaskDance with GitHub. And I'm just gonna come up with an arbitrary name. Let's say FlaskCon test dance GitHub. I don't know, it doesn't really matter. It's going to auto-generate a secret key, and then I'm going to need a GitHub OAuth client ID and a GitHub OAuth client secret, but I'm gonna get to that later. So first, let's deploy this with the incorrect values. So we do not expect this application to work until we've gotten the API key and secret from GitHub. But for reasons that I'll go into in a moment, I'm actually going to deploy it first so that I can get a live version of this website. And then I'll be able to get the API key and secret. So just waiting for Heroku to build my application and deploy it. If you've never used Heroku before, it's a really, really handy way of deploying applications, and it's free to get started, although in my experience, fairly expensive for actual production usage. So now we go to the website and we got redirected to this github.com/login OAuth, and we get a 404, which is not surprising because again, we haven't actually set this up correctly. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my settings in GitHub, and I'm going to scroll down to my developer settings, and there's a section for OAuth apps. Now this is where we set up a API key and secret. So I'm going to call this FlaskCon demo app. Homepage URL, I think that's going to be the one from Heroku. So we'll say, I'm going to copy this link. Here we go. And the authorization callback URL. Now this is the thing that is important. This is a security measure. It's part of OAuth to say when the user gets redirected back to the application, this is where they should go. And by default, if you're using FlaskDance, the URL is going to be your public URL /login/ whatever provider you're using, so GitHub/authorized. And you can read the documentation to learn more about how that gets constructed. And I'll just say this is a demo app with description, register application. Cool. All right, so here is our magical client ID and client secret. This is the thing that will allow the whole OAuth process to work. So now I need to go to my settings and update my configuration variables. So I'm going to put my client ID, oh, I need to edit it. Client ID goes here, and then hit that save button. And the client secret to, oops, sorry about that. Too many buttons in too many places. All right, let's do the client secret. Paste, save changes. Is going to cause our application to redeploy. And let's try this again. I'm going to open a new tab. And hey, look at that. So now we got correctly redirected to GitHub. You can see with the URL that we're actually on github.com. And this is the part of the OAuth dance where GitHub is asking, is it okay for me to share information about your GitHub account to this third-party application, to this OAuth consumer? So this is saying this application, FlaskCon demo app, wants to have information about your public data, such as your email address and such. And I'm going to say authorize Singing Wolf Boy, and that will redirect me back to the application. And hey, look at that. Now, my OAuth app is able to make API requests and can correctly identify that I am Singing Wolf Boy on GitHub. And because this is a live application, any of you right now can go to this URL, FlaskCon test dance GitHub flas-dance.herokuapp.com, and you'll be able to go through that same OAuth dance to make the third-party consumer application aware that you have granted permission to share your email address on GitHub. Awesome. That was actually an incredibly easy way to go through the fairly complicated OAuth dance. And that's why I made FlaskDance. Now, that was, of course, the easiest possible way to use FlaskDance. There's lots of other options in there, including ways that you can store your token. So there's a couple of different pages in the documentation that is helpful to read through, such as user management, understanding the difference between a local user on your website versus a remote user on Google or Facebook, that sort of thing. And trying to understand how OAuth works and how all these concepts map together are important for being able to make FlaskDance work the way that you want. But the basics of it are what we've just gone through right now. So conceptually, once a user has gone through that dance, they are able to, you as the consumer application are able to make API requests just like this. So in this case, we're using this object called GitHub to make an API request to the GitHub API, just like with the requests library. This actually uses the requests library under the hood. And in this case, we're doing /user to contact the GitHub API at the URL api.github.com/user. And then we're going to use the response information to do whatever we want with it. In this case, using that login information from the response object. And that's how it's able to figure out that I am singing Wolf Boy on GitHub. The code is very short and very easy to understand, I think. You can also do anything you want with your API once you have authorized the user with it. And you can define what sort of scopes you want as well. So as long as I have some extra time in this presentation, let me go here. And you can see that this make GitHub blueprint function is the function that I was using. And if you want to get more information about the user, you can use this scope option to provide a list of scopes based on what the GitHub API provides. So there's a bridge between what FlaskDance can do for you and what the provider application, what the provider API offers. Of course, you can't use FlaskDance to do something that the provider API doesn't offer, but the scope attribute allows you to specify information to say what data you need from the user after they go through that dance. At this point, I am basically out of time, so I think I'm just going to open it up to questions.
You still have 3 minutes on your talk if you want to keep talking to us, because apparently everyone loves your demo.
Well, I'm really glad to hear that, but I think I'll take the extra time to take a couple of extra questions.
Perfect.
Because I don't really have anything else that I need to say right now. So let me open up my room, FlaskCon. Cool.
Perfect. So let's see, everyone, questions.
Yeah, I'm really happy with how smoothly the whole process works as well. Okay, here's a question. Common security pitfalls one can do using FlaskDance. There's not really that many. You do want to make sure that you're using all the proper security benefits of the OAuth protocol, but FlaskDance should do that for you automatically. Another thing is that when you receive this OAuth token from the API provider, you need to think about where you're going to store that token and how to treat it securely. Because as I said, you should treat it as securely as you would a user's password. So you shouldn't just save it in a place where anyone can view it. You should save it securely in a database. In this example, in this demo that I have, the OAuth token is actually getting saved in the user's cookie, which is fine. It's a secure place to save information and it's only visible to that user. So it's not something you have to worry about. But for a production application, you may want to switch to a different token storage system there's a token storage system set up for SQL Alchemy as well to make it super easy to store tokens directly in your database. So you might want to check out the documentation for that, but really that's just an optimization to make it more production ready. All right, security pitfalls. Does FlaskDance work with the Flask Security 2 extension? I have no idea. I've never used Flask Security 2. I have used regular vanilla Flask Security, and that uses Flask login under the hood, and I know that it works just fine with Flask login and by extension Flask Security. In fact, I even have a quick start here on this page, Google with Flask Security. So if you want to learn how to set this up with Flask Security, I have this example repository, which if you go into the app directory, you can see in it, I think. Yeah, so we're pulling some stuff from Flask Security and using it that way. So it should be pretty easy to understand and to adapt to your specific use case. Plans to support OpenID Connect. That is a good question. I'm totally open to pull requests. To be honest, I don't know that much about OpenID Connect. Simple OAuth has been a protocol that I've been working with, and I know that OpenID Connect is sort of a layer on top of OAuth. I don't really know the details of how that would work, but it would be great if we could make FlaskDance work with OpenID Connect as well. If you're interested in that, then let's chat / send a pull request. Mike Barkman asks, do the tokens in OAuth expire? And that is a question that is specific to the OAuth provider. Most of the time, these tokens do not expire. Sometimes they do expire and you can automatically refresh them with a refresh URL. But again, that's not something that FlaskDance handles. That is something that is specific to every individual provider. They can design their API however they want. Do you support implicitly using refresh tokens? I believe we do. FlaskDance is built on top of the OAuth lib library and the requests OAuth lib library. And I believe those libraries do support that. But to be honest, there hasn't been a whole lot of testing for that. I've done it a little bit and it seems to work, but it also might break in obscure cases. And if that happens, then please let me know so that we can fix it. JHB asks if OAuth 2 is supported. Yes. The demo that I just did with GitHub is OAuth 2. Most providers are doing OAuth 2 these days. OAuth 1 is not very widely used. I think Twitter is the only provider that is widely known that does OAuth 1 these days. And FlaskDance does both OAuth 1 and OAuth 2, but to be honest, has better testing and better support for OAuth 2. Cool. Thanks for information about OpenID Connect. And yeah, we can look more into that later when I'm not on the spot in a live demo and answering questions like that. I'm really glad that everybody's so excited about this. I built this library actually out of anger because I wasn't happy with the existing OAuth libraries that were out there. And I figured, well, I can make this simpler to use. I can build on top of the Flask blueprint architecture. And I did that, and it's been working really well.
Awesome. Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that with us.
Yeah, no problem.
There's people in Discord saying that they're going to have a look at your library for their application.
Yeah, that's great. I know that there are people who are using this library in production for their applications, and that makes me really happy. I'm really glad that I've built something that people are actually using. If you want to continue to make people aware of FlaskDance and what it is and how it works, don't forget to go to the GitHub repository and star it over here. I have less than 1,000 stars, and it would be awesome if I could change that and have that number go way, way up. Yes, it's meaningless internet points, but I like my meaningless internet points.
Well, that's David, everyone.